Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. نرحب فيكم جميعا سادة وسيدات ونبدأ الحوار مع البروفيسور جيفري. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. Let me say what an enormous pleasure and honor it is to be back in Dubai. And I want to congratulate you for having this wonderful government summit. I'm sure not only will Dubai and the Emirates benefit enormously, but I know the whole world will benefit enormously from the brainstorming and the leadership that you're showing on asking some very deep and important questions about the role of government, the way to use new technologies, the way to provide government services in new and innovative ways, and I'm happy to say the ways to promote the happiness and well-being of the population. And the fact that the Emirates has taken on the challenge of happiness, of course, is something that makes me very happy. I think that this is a path-breaking and bold way to view governance and a bold way to think about new approaches to sustainable development in the 21st century. You've had some of the world's leading experts in the last couple of days speaking about new ways to deliver services, new ways to use information technology, new approaches to organizing government efforts. I want to step back just for a few minutes, perhaps to become a little bit philosophical about this issue, to ask, what do we mean by happiness? What does it mean to promote happiness in the population? And so if this is a little bit abstract, I hope that it's abstract in a way that comes together with the very practical deliberations that you've been pursuing and listening to in terms of the most cutting-edge technologies, the ways you're delivering new services and the new approaches. Well, if we're going to start with the philosophical approach, maybe we should start with a philosopher. And I think perhaps the most important philosopher in history for all of us, for this region and for the world, may be Aristotle. Because Aristotle, of course, played a fundamental role in helping the next 2,500 years think about the question of happiness. And Aristotle's writings played a fundamental role in the great Arab philosophies and philosophies of all of the major religions as well. Aristotle wrote a brilliant text which I find personally very inspiring, as have generations and generations of people for more than 2,000 years, a book called the Nicomachean Ethics. And in that book, he talked about the end purpose of life as being happiness. He said happiness is what humanity pursues. But he asked the question, what do we mean by happiness? And the book is really an exploration about the idea of happiness. In the Greek, Aristotle gave a name to his concept of happiness called eudaimonia. And it's a complicated topic. And it's one that I think is still relevant for us more than 2 millennia after he enunciated it. Because the basic point that Aristotle made, as with many of the great sages in history, is that happiness is not simply something that one delivers to others, or happiness is not simply the fulfillment of desires or the pursuit of material well-being, though that can be important. Happiness is a kind of striving for life, and to be happy means to pursue a certain kind of life as individuals and within society. And so one thing that government can do in terms of promoting happiness is to help people promote their own happiness, but also to demand from the public a certain kind of life and instruction, not only to deliver goods and services to the public. So the concept of eudaimonia, which I find to be a very compelling one, it starts from Aristotle's idea that humankind, all of us, are social animals. We live within society. It is our responsibility to be good members of the society. That's a responsibility of individuals. It doesn't come naturally necessarily, although it is part of our human nature. So happiness is a personal quest, not only a fulfillment of individual aspirations. Happiness means virtue, and this is an idea that I believe has been abandoned in most of our societies, and it's an important idea that needs to be recaptured. To be happy is to lead a virtuous life. A virtuous life is not an easy life to live. A virtuous life requires effort. It requires striving. It requires moral commitment. That's such a basic idea, but it is not one that is very prevalent in modern society. In the United States, my own country, we don't call on people to be virtuous. We say, go make money, that's all. Government doesn't have a sense that there is a responsibility of virtue, except rarely when we have leaders who call on the people for their own virtue. We remembered last year the 50th anniversary of President John F. Kennedy. He was one of the few leaders that gave the sense to the public that the public has responsibility of virtue as well. He said in his most famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And it's interesting, he was one of the few leaders that called on the public to do things, not the other way around. And he's the one that's remembered half a century later, because the public rose to the occasion when he called on the public for public service, for example, and didn't say to the public, "We'll do everything for you." He said, "What can you do for your country?" Aristotle emphasized that virtue is not something we're born with, it's something that we must strive to accomplish. I think this is also an extremely important idea. Virtue has to be learned. It has to be learned by good examples. It has to be learned by practice, by the practice of compassion, by the practice of mercy, by the practice of good works, and it has to be learned by instruction. And I believe that also. But this is not an idea that, again, is very prevalent. Sometimes freedom is taken to its extreme these days. That do what you want, maximize your freedom, maximize your pleasure. But this is not virtue, and it doesn't lead to happiness in the long term. And finally, Aristotle championed the concept of moderation. This was at the essence of his ethical theory. He said, you don't have to deny material well-being, but if you seek after it as the only goal, of course, it will not bring either virtue or fulfillment. One doesn't have to be reckless in bravery, but one shouldn't be overly timid. Find the moderate path. And I think this notion of finding a responsible path of moderation is also very important, especially in an age of excess. These ideas have been taken in very many different kinds of theories. One theory that I think is also helpful in thinking about happiness in this way is to say that as human beings, we have a hierarchy of needs. Of course, at the base is the physiological needs. People can't be happy if they are hungry. People cannot be happy if their children are dying of diseases that are preventable. There are still 1 billion people in the world at the base of this pyramid who do not meet the physiological needs of the planet. These are often the war zones. These are often the most unstable places in the world. People depend on safety, physical security. And then as the pyramid rises in needs, the needs become more spiritual, of love and belonging to society, of self-esteem, and of what in this theory is called self-actualization, or being able to solve problems, having the freedom to pursue moral objectives. A special attention needs to be paid to the happiness of children, especially because we have found scientifically that if children do not get a good start in life, it's almost impossible to recover many of the determinants of happiness and well-being later in life. There are so many children in the world born in poverty that by the time they are 6 or 7 years old, their brain has not developed, they have not had proper nutrition, they have not had proper security and love of families. Their fathers may be working 10,000 miles away. The family may not be secure. And so children do not have their most basic needs met. And what the science has shown about happiness is that many of the most important biological bases of lifetime happiness, the ability of our physical and psychological and intellectual development, forms in the first few years of life. And so I draw attention to the fact that promoting happiness is a lifetime of activity. It's a lifetime pursuit of virtue, but it also begins at the most vulnerable ages, so that children, and young children in particular, have to be the primary focus. This is a forgotten lesson in many places. In my own country, in the United States, we have perhaps 20 or 25% of children growing up in poverty right now in the United States. Our government does not care, the public doesn't pay attention, and poor children end up with deficiencies of education and even, I would say, moral and also behavioral deficiencies that last throughout a whole life because of the neglect at an early age. So one can be a very rich society, but not one that promotes happiness. This is the problem in the United States these days, in my opinion, because it's not paying attention to these critical needs in society. We know that when it comes to young children, a safe and loving environment, a minimum of physical stress, which changes the biology of a young child, the brain development and so forth, proper nutrition, proper health, parental presence and love, and cognitive stimulation are all essential. Now, in the last couple of years, and in partnership with the UAE, we have been pursuing a worldwide study of happiness, measuring as best as possible the evidence on happiness worldwide and the determinants of happiness. How do you measure happiness? There are two ways shown here. One is the emotional way, shown on the left with the happy face, we hope. Do people feel good? Are they smiling? Is their mood good? And one on the right, the more contemplative way, shown by Rodin's Thinker. What do people think about their lives? How do they reflect on the quality of their life? So psychologists have two different standards of measuring happiness. one that is more emotional, the other that is more reflective. It is the reflective way that is probably closest to Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia. In other words, how do you evaluate your life in the deeper sense? And to do that, psychologists ask a question. They make a survey of populations to measure what is called subjective well-being. So it's trying to get people to give a report, an account of their happiness. And the preferred method is now what is called this ladder of life, invented by a psychologist named Cantrill. And the question that people are asked all over the world is shown here. Assume that the ladder is a way of picturing your life. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life you can imagine. The bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life. Where do you place yourself on the ladder of life? Thanks to Gallup International, as well as surveys being conducted now by dozens of countries, we have a lot of data on how people assess the quality of their life. And thankfully, we can do statistical work on that cross-country data. It turns out, not surprisingly, that the answer to happiness has many dimensions that go back to Aristotle's teachings and go back to this concept of the hierarchy of values. So what counts in the reported measurement of happiness? Well, income per person definitely matters. So people who are more prosperous report a higher level of happiness. But they do so with what is called a diminishing marginal utility of income, meaning that every further dollar earned is associated with a smaller and smaller increment. Other things become more important. What are those other dimensions that become important after the basic needs are met? Of course, the social support in the society is very important. When people are asked, do you have family or friends that you can rely on in need? Some people are isolated, other people have strong social support. Those with social support are far happier than those who live lives essentially of isolation. An individual's health, of course, is a key determinant of life satisfaction, and this is physical health as well as mental health. Freedom, the sense of ability to make life choices that are important, is a major determinant of happiness. Something that's very important in my view is that when people live in a society that they feel is a generous society, they also individually feel better off. In other words, values matter. Virtuous behavior matters. If the society is only pursuing materialistic objectives, but is not charitable, is not looking after those in need, is not expressing voluntarism to help, then the society does not prosper. I think that this is one of the great insights of Islam, that zakat is one of the fundamental pillars of a good life. And this idea, in my opinion, is a deep need of humanity. Individuals cannot be happy in societies that do not practice virtuous behavior. And finally, and very importantly, individuals are happy or unhappy depending on their perception of the virtues of their government. When the perception of corruption is very high, even if individuals are living well, they do not feel very secure or very happy. And therefore, the quality of governance, the rule of law, the sense of justice and fairness, the transparency of political decision-making are all very important determinants of the reported well-being in the society. I personally like this evidence a lot. Why? Because it emphasizes to us that happiness is a goal to strive for that depends both on the responsibility of individuals, on the health of the society, and on the performance of government. Happiness is not simply to be delivered. Happiness is to be achieved by individuals, and it is to be achieved by the pursuit of decent and virtuous life. I emphasize this because in a world where we have so much plenty, where we have the technology to solve every kind of problem, when there is no excuse for poverty, when there's no excuse for violence against different groups, because there's no shortage of means to fulfill every basic need, the route to happiness is not primarily through material goods. The route to happiness is primarily a moral opportunity. And if we can find the values to promote well-being, then we know the technology, our wealth, our economic potential will be able to deliver the well-being. But we forget that when materialism or short-sightedness or greed becomes the basis of society. And I know from many places that this is a danger for all of us in the 21st century. When we look at the map of happiness captured in this global survey, we can see the variations. Fortunately, here we're in a very happy region. The United Arab Emirates ranks among the happiest places in the world, and this is going to be even more true as a result of the pioneering work that is being done in this country to lead this effort and to discover new ways to promote happiness. But of course, we also live in a world of lots of unhappiness as well, where there is still unmet poverty, where people, young children, are dying, more than 6 million every year before the age of 5 because their most basic needs cannot be met. And we know in this region there's lots of violence that remains, violence that could be solved by the right kind of governance and the right kind of attention to more basic human needs. At the top of the ladder are the countries shown here. Denmark has come out #1 in the survey for 2 years in a row. Scandinavia is a very impressive part of the world in my experience. I've spent a lot of time in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. There's a very good balance of life, lots of prosperity, but also lots of social responsibility. The government spends a lot of money to ensure that all children, for example, have a good start in life, that education is of high quality, that the poor can be secure. There's a lot of global social responsibility as well, because those countries give a very high proportion of their national income to help the global poor. You'll see that the UAE is number 14 on the list. This is a great accomplishment, and I'm sure that it reflects the very hard work that is being undertaken in this country with a lot of insight and creativity to promote widespread well-being. You rate 3 steps above the United States, which is ranked number 17. I a little bit fear for my country, but I hope that we can take your example and keep up. At the bottom of the ladder are countries in poverty and countries in crisis. I work in a lot of these countries in my capacity in the United Nations as Special Advisor to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. You'll see a mix of countries. Some of them are impoverished. and fighting basic disease and illiteracy. They need help to meet the physiological needs of the people. Some, like Syria, like Yemen, like Afghanistan, are war-torn countries. They have no right to be so low, no need to be so low, but we have to end the wars in these countries because this is the devastation that causes the most intense unhappiness. And in my opinion, I'm sorry to say, there's no purpose for these wars. These are destruction of lives and destruction of countries that are some of the wonders of civilization, and yet we are very careless, especially when the outside doesn't pay attention to the needs to end the conflict quickly in these countries. There has also been recently a report by UNICEF that I want to draw your attention to, which is a report card for children. This is of the countries of the OECD. Those are the high-income countries, mainly of Europe, and they have done a very good test of looking at children's needs being met. Again, I'm compelled to say it, I hope you understand why, but my own country, the United States, ranks 25th on this list, 25th from the top. The reason I mention it is that I live in the richest country in the world, but that's not enough for happiness. A country can have everything materially, but if it doesn't have the values, if it doesn't promote the virtue, it will not achieve the happiness. And this, I believe, is why it's such an important lesson and why we need to wake up so urgently. The United States should not be 25th on the list of the well-being of its children, but it is. And when one looks at that material and objective well-being of children, is there proper health? Is there proper nutrition? Is there preschool? And compares it to the children's own report of their own happiness, because children also can be asked, are you happy? One ends up with a graph that looks like this. On the horizontal axis are the measures of objective well-being. For example, are there programs of early childhood education? And on the vertical axis is the child's own report of whether they feel secure and feel a high level of well-being. And while the fit is not perfect, what it shows is that by providing objective bases of child development, children feel more secure. There's a positive relationship, which is very important. I think that everything that the Emirates is doing to promote happiness will lead in the direction of promoting a better world. Focusing on the children is an incredibly important part of that. That's building the next generation. I want to thank the Emirates, first of all, for taking this leadership, which is unique, and having a summit like this, which can benefit the whole world. And I also want to say, on behalf of all of us who are visitors here, how excited we are about Expo 2020 as well, because we believe that this will provide an inspiration also for the whole world. People will come here, we will see what you are accomplishing, and we will see in the Expo a vision of a good future. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Professor Sachs for this excellent presentation. And I ask for the excuse to speak in Arabic for a few words. سعيد جدا بتقديم البروفيسور جيفري زاكس. أحد أساتذتي كان دائما يقول
Sachs, they are saying that introductions are coming in the end. So I think that Professor Jeffrey Sachs is well known internationally as an expert and as a pioneer in the field of development studies and to combat poverty. I knew him as a student and he was in the London School of Economics, and the first test was a question to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the economic crisis in Poland, so I cannot forget his name. But Professor Jeffrey Sachs, during the 90s, had a very important role during the economic transfer, political transfer in the Eastern Europe, and he made a great help to provide solutions for these countries to move from their economic perspective to the open trade and to combat poverty and to combat some of the negative phenomena in these economics. We are very pleased to have him. During the 2005, he published a very important book under the title of Finishing Poverty. And this year, he has a very distinguished book, How to Save the World, which is a history of the JFK, Kennedy president, and how he had a vision to change the United States into a better environment. Jeffrey Sachs' ideas are really clear, and really he's trying to reflect his ideas through his work in the United Nations and with the General Secretary Ban Ki-moon. And he worked in the Land Foundation related to Columbia University, and he's concentrating on development. Today, his speech was concentrating on focusing on happiness, and it's really an innovative subject and topic in this government summit. And Gulf countries witnessed during the last years new wealth, which had a meaning and a very important meaning about today. The meaning of today during the last decades, it seems that in the Gulf region, we lost the meaning of happiness and the real definition of happiness. And maybe the meaning of happiness is really different for us. In the government summit and launching such a topic, I think that it's last year I attended a forum and a session in Germany, and we were surprised that Angela Merkel presided the session, and under the title of the government role played to provide happiness. It was about the government and executives' role and how they could provide happiness to the people. And we discovered that this is the real role played by the governments. The topic today was wonderful, and I think that Dubai, with its pioneer role, could provide a model that we could call serving happiness by the government. Any graduate in the Arab countries, in the Arab universities, most of them have the dream and the will to work in Dubai and not to work in the European capitals or in the United States, but in Dubai. And one of the graduates, I asked him why he would like to work in Dubai, and the answer was easy: the way of life. And it's a really innovative way of life. And people who are visiting Dubai and this country, the UAE, they have this answer that they always see something new in the UAE. And during this morning, we are really pleased with what Professor Sachs said. I will raise some questions in the English language.
I'm really interested, as a student and now as somebody who's moderating your session, to actually understand how a citizen can provide for the happiness of a society within a state.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that nice, nice words, which I really appreciate. I'm going to go back to Aristotle one more time, because Aristotle was writing especially about citizens. Aristotle lived in Athens, and for him, the idea of the right place for human beings was the city-state. So he talked about what in Greek is the polis. That means to be a citizen and to be a participant in one's society. So for Aristotle, being a virtuous person living a good life, a fulfilling life, was intrinsically also being a good citizen. And that means participating in solving the problems of society. And this, I think, is a very important aspect for the 21st century. We have, all of us as citizens, both an opportunity and a need to participate in problem solving. The world is filled with great opportunities. You're seeing some of the leading breakthroughs in technology in this summit in the last 3 days. But the world, unfortunately, is also filled with problems. I don't have to recount all of the problems, but let me just say one that I didn't mention so far is the global environmental crisis, which is going to be a huge crisis in the future. It's already a big crisis, but it's going to get worse in the future. All over the world, in every place, whether it's Dubai or whether it's New York City or whether it's it's Damascus or whether it's Beijing, citizens are going to have to solve local problems about climate change, about increasing weather instability, about changing energy systems. And one of the things that this government is doing here to encourage that kind of citizen participation that I think is very exciting is engaging students as citizens, as problem solvers. And so the idea is to really build a society that is robustly solving problems, addressing needs, alert to new opportunities. And that is a role of the citizens, not only a role of government solving the problems, but a role of government empowering citizens to solve these problems. One of the things that I'm doing with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is helping to create a global knowledge network that aims to bring universities and students from all over the world together in a virtual online network so that in every part of the world there can be active engagement in improving life and in solving problems. And that, I believe, is going to be not only crucial for meeting challenges like climate change, but also crucial for creating happiness, because it will create engagement, responsibility, the sense of meaning in life, purpose, and that also we see at the spiritual level is part of what makes people happy and fulfilled.
Now, during your presentation, I was struck by the idea of trying to measure happiness. And one of the components or one of the issues always addressed here is the income issue. Now, can we measure happiness by income? And when we say income, does the GDP really matters to states? Are those states with much more wealth are much more happy than other states with less resources?
So we know that money matters, but money isn't everything. And man does not live by bread alone, as the expression has put it for 2,000 years. What we find in the data is that being poor really hurts. Being wealthy raises well-being, but after a certain point, not by very much compared to other aspects of life. And in the United States, we have been grappling with a paradox that since 1960, the per capita income in the United States on average has gone up by 3 times, but the measured well-being has not changed at all for 60 years. And this is a worrisome point. America is not one of the happiest places in the world, even though it's one of the richest, because it's devoted too much effort to the material side and not enough effort to some of the other crucial determinants of happiness. So like anything, if you pursue one direction too far, it will have, at the best, diminishing returns, smaller and smaller gains. At the worst, it takes you and takes the society away from things that really matter more. For instance, the health of the communities, the promotion of the well-being of children, the promotion of generous, compassionate behavior. And so I would say that income matters, but especially to meet the basic needs. It matters less and less the wealthier one gets, and other things then matter a lot more and need a balanced focus. Again, what all of the great sages in history have said is follow a moderate pursuit of material life. Whether it was Aristotle or Buddha or others, they all talked about the middle path between denial and excess. And it's that moderate path, I think, that is what the evidence shows is the most fulfilling approach to the question of income and well-being. If you neglect the other crucial determinants, we end up with an unhappy society.
Now, you've been advising governments from Poland to Slovenia to Latin America to Africa. What lessons can you draw now when you're lecturing on happiness? How do governments actually reach a level of understanding of how to deliver happiness to their people?
I think it's a wonderful question. First, as you can imagine, I believe that governments have an enormous role and responsibility. So this is the first point. Second, I believe that governments can accomplish a lot. Third, I think that the intention of government matters a lot. Governments that are aiming for good results and that are trusted by the population can accomplish a lot of change. I've been involved in a lot of crisis situations where countries have a major financial crisis or a major economic crisis or a major political crisis. And I've been involved in working with those countries to help overcome the crisis. Sometimes it has succeeded, sometimes not, but the main thing that I've observed is that the trust of the public, of their government, is crucial for success. But government has to win that trust by being clear, by promoting a clear vision, and by operating transparently and competently so that the public says, we may not like everything that's happening, but we trust that the government is trying its best to accomplish these outcomes. And when that trust exists, then governments are able to accomplish many important changes, even ones that in the short term could be quite unpopular, because the public says, if we trust the government to be taking us in a right direction, then there's a lot of scope for that kind of action. That's what I saw in Poland, for example. When communism ended, Poland was in deep crisis. It needed to make deep changes. There was a lot of worry about that, but people trusted the government, and the government was able to get a lot accomplished.
I've been discussing with some officials in some Arab governments, and one of them struck me with a question that happiness is rather idealistic, in the sense that governments will never realize a position or a breaking point which they can start saying that they're providing happiness to their own people, that problems and crises will never end, especially if you live in a region where conflict is the normalcy down there. What's the take?
I think, like everyone, we're trying to figure out what will it take to reduce the extreme conflicts in this region. Because this is a region that is beset by unhappiness right now in many places. because of so much instability. And I'm afraid I have no magic answer to that question, just like nobody else does. But I do feel that in many places in crisis, maybe if the outside world would rather support a sense of compromise and peace rather than supporting one side or another in conflict, we'd actually get a little bit farther than we're getting right now. There's a lot of meddling in countries, not for their own purpose, but because these places are seen as part of a bigger conflict between big powers. That's very dangerous. The Middle East has always been a place where there's too much outside meddling and not enough opportunity for internal leadership. But I believe that this is a time when, if these conflicts can be ended, this is a time when this region could have a great flowering of creativity and great progress. So I'm very, without having a magic formula, I'm hoping that we can move to solve conflicts like the Syrian conflict by ending the violence fast and allowing some healing to take place.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the Syrian issue, you've written advising the government not to interfere in Syria.
Outside governments.
Outside governments. But at the same time, you've raised the issue of having to prove evidence that the government in Syria has used chemical weapons. Now, in this situation where it's very evident that it's not going to end by the people who are fighting on both sides, what's your take on how those issues can be resolved other than, international powers such as the United States and others actually trying to put some pressure to end it?
Well, again, these are very complicated topics outside of my specific remit, but I believe that in a conflict like Syria, the most important thing is to stop the inflow of arms coming from all sides, because Syria is a beautiful country. It's one of the cradles of civilization, and it's being destroyed very rapidly by heavy armaments and by feeding that conflict from all of the neighbors and from the outside world. We shouldn't feed violent conflict. We should starve violent conflict. Not starve the people, feed the people, but starve the conflict. There is too much flow of arms into Syria. It's not going to end this conflict because no party to that conflict is going to become dominant militarily compared to others if all sides are pouring in weapons. Keep the weapons out, stop the fighting, and then there can be a political compromise. I've seen many successful political compromises in my work over the years. I've worked in more than 130 countries in the world. You don't win a battle by trying to be the complete victor in a situation. I'll just give you one example. In 1989, Poland was trying to escape from the control of the Soviet Union. And Poland was in a transition from communism to a European, become a normal European country and a democratic country. And it required a compromise between many different powers. The president at the time, President Jaruzelski, was the president during the communist era, and there was an opposition movement. And rather than the opposition movement saying, we will crush the existing power, or the existing power saying, we will crush the opposition, they said, we will compromise. President Jaruzelski remained president even as the opposition entered the government. So it was a coalition of forces, not one side winning and the other side losing. And over time, 2 years later, President Jaruzelski stepped down from the presidency. There was a continuing transition. But it showed to me that you don't win by an all or nothing proposition. You win by saying, let us not descend into conflict, let us find a compromise, and then let time heal and find new ways out of this. In Syria, each side saying, we must win, the other side must lose. And all that's happening is that Syria is losing because it's being destroyed by conflict. The most beautiful places in the world are just rubble now. Places that were the cradle of civilization 7,000 years ago, reduced to rubble in our time. And that's because each side saying, we must dominate. If the United States says this must be the government and the other party says that must be the government, we're not going to get a solution. If the Syrians can come up with a compromise, then the world should support it, and the world should stop pouring in weapons, in my opinion, and therefore let some peace find a practical solution.
Now, in the past 3 years, there have been debates about the Arab uprisings, and there are many sides to the debate. One of them is that gradual reform and modernization of a state and an economy is the right path to realizing the happiness of a society. Now, the other argument is based on the radical transformation, having a revolution, and there have been some jubilation in Western media about the Arab Spring, about the democratic promise that it might bring. But after 3 years of wars and conflict zones and losing even liberties and the economic prosperities in some of the countries, now the example is pointing back to the gradual reform, to say that the examples, for instance, of Dubai as a city, of the United Arab Emirates, of other states who have gradually modernized their country, who have gradually reformed their system in a way to provide their citizens with the well-being plus with their political liberties. Now, how can we access that debate from your side? What's your opinion on it?
Again, I think the issue is obviously very complicated. I don't want to be presumptuous, but when I watch a country that I have really admired and cared for a lot, like Egypt, be now so divided in society, two sides fighting each other, again with the idea that the way forward is for one side to crush the other, this will not work. And it was clear to me 3 years ago, and it became more and more clear in watching the very difficult period in Egypt, that there was not sufficient dialogue between the different parties, because there really are very different perspectives. And no part of Egyptian society is the legitimate Egyptian society. There are differences in religious view, there are differences in social outlook, there are differences in class and political outlook. And what Egypt has missed so far, in my opinion, is dialogue. And this worries me a lot, because Egypt is a country 7,000 years old. It's an ancient civilization. To watch it where it's just clash, and again with outside interests saying, we support that side, we support that side, this is not going to give the results that people are hoping for.
Now, on Egypt, I've met with the former President Mohamed Morsi and also the interim President Adli Mansour. And Adli Mansour is also a judge who is specialized in constitutions. Now, one of the things that struck me when I chatted with Adli Mansour is that he mentioned something about the constitution. And he said that during the Muslim Brotherhood rule of Egypt, the constitution was redrafted in a more in a way that limited the liberty of people, limited their expectation of their way of life. And he was saying that their proposed constitution, which they have voted for, was all about that, trying to restore a constitution. Now, my question is about, do constitutions really matter when it comes to happiness? Having the pursuit of happiness in a constitution, does it really matter?
you know, when a country is in political turmoil, the question is to find a process that can be felt as legitimate and to give some sense of direction in the country. And if you look at the details of the Egyptian experience from the beginning of the Arab Spring, so-called, till now, I would say that each side tried to take maximum advantage tactically whenever it could, rather than trying to find an opening that would bridge across divides of the society. And each side has found that going for the maximum tactic has turned out badly at some point. It worries me, frankly, to go to something very controversial. If the current government just cracks down, arrests a former president, outlaws a movement, and so forth, it may be able to do that as a matter of power, but it won't heal the society. And if any group that represents a small part of society feels that it can tactically try to dominate, Egypt will remain an unstable country, and that is very dangerous for the whole region, because we need Egypt as a stable, prosperous country and a major leader in the world. And so I very much worry about this tactical attempt, go to the streets, take power, crack down on the other side, swings back and forth. Of course, this is very dangerous in the end, and we should be emphasizing, in my opinion, dialogue, openness, and compromise, rather than victory of one side tactically over another.
Now, I'll end up with a final question regarding economics. Now, on my way here, I've told some of my students about meeting you, and one of them has mentioned something to me to ask you. Actually, the consumer price index and inflation. We don't see those two factors in any of the happiness indexes that we see. We see the GDP, we see other factors, but we don't see the consumer price index, which actually is how people measure their material wealth, you know. And the other thing is about inflation. You know, is there any relationship between how you measure happiness and inflation?
It's a good question. If you are in a country with high inflation, you will find an unhappy country. If you are in a country with soaring inflation, as I've worked in many times, you will find an extremely unhappy country. There was a famous line of Lenin, actually, who reportedly said that there is no surer way to overturn society than to debauch the currency. And so as a revolutionary, he said that inflation would be the way to create social disorder. Well, I can tell you that's true because I've worked in many countries that had hyperinflations, and I was, of course, trying to help them stabilize prices. The reason that it doesn't appear here is that most of the world actually has succeeded in keeping inflation quite low in recent years. But if you look at the few places where inflation is quite high, you'll find unhappiness. And so perhaps we should try it statistically to measure that in next year's report.
On this note, I would like to thank Professor Sachs on this great presentation, and I would like also to thank the government of Dubai on selecting this topic for this year. Thank you all for listening, and thanks, Professor.